Welcome to episode 4 of Behind the Bills. I'm Iván Carrillo. On today's show, we're talking about the latest developments at the state capitol. Where do things stand with the end of the legislative session just a week away? Plus, Barrett Snider from our friends at Capitol Advisors will join me for a conversation you don't want to miss. All that and much more straight ahead. So let's jump right in. As we're taping this, we are 10 days away from the end of the 2-year legislative session. This past week, we had 2 significant hearings. Both appropriations committees for the Senate and the Assembly met to act on their suspense files. So bills that are on suspense are any proposals that have an estimated price tag of over $50,000. The suspense hearings are where many bills die. Other bills are significantly amended and look very different afterward. There were a number of bills that ACSA has been highly engaged in. You've heard me talk about them on previous episodes. Let me start with AB 2557. This is a bill that would have compromised contracts that schools have for services that students depend on. Any contracts that LEAs have, whether it be for mental health services, whether it be for nurses, therapists, folks that are supporting expanded learning opportunity programs, all these would have been subject to dramatically new reporting requirements. We heard loud and clear from community-based organizations that this would give them pause for contracting with us. We had heard directly from you as well just how costly and cumbersome this process would have been to gather reports, to put them on your website. But I'm happy to report that this bill is no longer. This bill died. This bill was held on the suspense file. And this is a product of our collective work. This is an example of the power of coalition work. ACSA joined dozens and dozens of other public agency organizations. We were joined by our partners at CASBO, the school business officials representing the educational management side of things. And we made the case successfully. And as a result, this bill is no longer. AB 2088 is another bill that we were monitoring closely. We have been making the case since this bill was introduced that it's bad policy and will impact students directly. AB 2088 would dramatically change how schools can hire classified workers, classified employees. Part of what this bill says is that schools, with their hiring, must prioritize years of service versus relevant experience. It's our job to make sure that we're getting the most highly qualified individuals in these positions. AB 2088 would prevent this. This bill, unfortunately, did get out of the suspense hearing and continues to move, but there was progress. The bill got bipartisan opposition. You heard that correct, bipartisan opposition. Senator Angelique Ashby out of Sacramento, a Democrat, voted no on the bill. So this begins to chip away at things. The more bipartisan opposition, the better, because it provides the governor cover and makes the case for what we hope is an eventual veto. Speaking of the governor, he put out a letter a week ago urging school leaders to immediately restrict cell phones ahead of the new school year. This is a topic that we've been talking about for a long time now. Most recently, we had a lunch break episode with LAUSD where we did a deep dive into this. School leaders are in tune with the negative effects of cell phone usage. You see it directly firsthand on school campuses. The bottom line is this topic does deserve attention and action, but we were confused with the timing of the governor's letter. Many schools had already started. Many other schools were just days away from the launch of their school year. But we know from conversations with our members that implementing a cell phone restriction policy is something that takes a lot of work. It requires conversations at the school board level. It requires conversations with the broader school community, with your local teachers unions. It requires professional development and trainings, conversations and communications with parents and students. All that is necessary to effectively implement some type of policy. And we've also heard from our members that it's not feasible for educators to be policing cell phone use, and that if that were put on them, that it opens up a whole other can of worms. So while we appreciate the governor putting attention on this and talking about the negative effects of cell phone use on young people and on their mental health and their well-being, we think there needs to be a broader, holistic conversation to this. And that's why we continue to uplift legislation, one of which that we're co-sponsoring. And that bill would begin to address the addictive algorithms that are pushed to young people in their social media use. Another piece of legislation that would put more responsibility on social media companies to take down harmful posts when things are reported to them. So I'm happy to report these two bills moved out of the suspense hearing. They're continuing to move. We're going to continue to put our force behind them to get this to the governor's desk and hope that they're eventually signed. Barrett Snider, a good friend, partner at Capital Advisors. Welcome.
Thanks, buddy.
I'm happy to have you here on Behind the Bills.
I love that you have a podcast now. This is the best. I always knew you were going places, but the fact that you have your own podcast, I love this. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, no, thanks. Welcome. I'm looking forward to the conversation and just know there's a lot to dive into, a lot of interesting stuff taking place in our world and just the policy and political world. I'll say, and I know you know this because you see the number of members that just respond when you and the Capital Advisors team talk about just the political landscape. There's a lot of interest when you have your peer politics session, for instance. Just let's take a step back before we get into just where we're at in this process, and we just talked a little bit about suspense file. The political landscape, it's changed a lot over the years.
Mm-hmm.
It's evolving quickly. Just how are you seeing things, and what's standing out to you in terms of the politics side of this world?
Yeah, for sure, evolved is a great word for it. There's a lot going on, right? There's an election. We're continuing to see the effects of term limits push a lot of members out. And, during the pandemic, we saw a bunch of members just decide not to run again. Patrick O'Donnell from down in LA is a great example now over at the California School Boards Association. But a lot of members just kind of, deciding not to do things. Term limits are running out. A bunch of them wanting to run for statewide office, right? So you've just got a lot of change and turnover. We've got two new leaders in both houses. Mike McGuire on the Senate side, who's termed out in 2026, so he's not going to be there very long. And then Robert Rivas in the Assembly. So this was sort of their first years running. And they're trying to corral Democratic caucuses that are 3/4 of both houses of the legislature, and that is like herding cats. You've got environmentalists, you've got, equity-minded folks, you've got people that are wanting to champion healthcare issues, they want to expand education and workers' rights, and that's all fitting in under the same tent, and so that's just hard. And you combine that with a budget, revenue situation for the state that makes it increasingly right now difficult to address those needs. So there's all that going on, and then also in our world, how much of what we talk about in terms of policy changes now is happening in the state budget process, and not as much in legislation. And, I'm not a fan of that. I think we get a lot of things wrong sometimes because we move too fast in the budget process. There's something to be said for giving issues a hearing and letting people come talk and hear about the practical realities of implementing that policy in a school, right? There might be some academic research that highlights the benefits of X, but how you implement that in a diverse state like California, where you've got districts as small as 5 kids and as big as LA Unified, and the diversity in those, everything in between there, that can be a challenge. So yeah, there's just a lot going on in the political realm that's being affected by the election, the budget situation, and all that.
You talked about the two new leaders of the Assembly and the Senate, and just now that we're, about a year in or so, what from your perspective have been like the most significant changes that we've seen under the two leaders from their predecessors?
Sure, and well, you know me, I'm the primary advocate for the Small School Districts Association. One of the good things that I've seen from that perspective is there's we've worked with Senator McGuire for years on districts that have been impacted by emergencies, fires, and he's been our go-to guy. His wife's an administrator, I'm sure you guys have talked about on this podcast before, but he kind of gets it, and that's been nice to have that person there. And then obviously Robert Rivas from Hollister, and he just gets these issues as well. So that's been a nice thing, that there's more diversity and thought around the implementation of a lot of bills and budget things we've talked about.
Yeah, historically, the speaker and the pro tem have been out of major urban metropolitan areas, right? Los Angeles, Sacramento, Bay Area, San Diego. So it's definitely a departure from trends historically speaking.
Yeah, and that's been positive. A lot of the staff stayed, which I think is really interesting. They didn't have to keep them, and they're friends of ours and people that we've known for 20 years, and so it's you're always wanting folks to stick around. That's important, because I think when you see big turnover with staff, you often get big shifts in policy, and so I think there's some. Of course, depending on the issue, if there's an issue that you haven't been able to get any traction on, you're probably not going to get any traction on it. But it also, it's a cast of characters in terms of staff that we've all known and worked with, and we're all sort of known entities to each other. So that's important, I think, to acknowledge that there wasn't a giant flip of people in either case in both houses.
Under prior leadership, committee chairs were very much empowered to make decisions about bills and bills, whether or not they even got the time of day, right? Or they got any consideration. And then there's been a changing of approach just in terms of how leadership is now engaging in conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Can you unpack that a little bit and just I know there's pros and cons on both sides of that, right?
Sure. But, I think this is particularly true on the Assembly side, right? That Speaker Rivas came in, and largely to a promise to some of the folks that supported him that I'm going to run it differently. There was some pent-up frustration that under the prior speaker, that committee chairs could unilaterally decide to just not hear bills and just kill them, and very empowering to the chairs of the committees. In this case, we've got a speaker that says, "No, I'm gonna play heavily in making decisions about what bills get in and out." That comes with its own politics for the speaker. Of the buck stops with him, kind of on what lives and dies. Then you've got a caucus that's huge, 60 plus Democrats. You got to try and keep enough happy to keep your job. So that's a little bit of an experiment. We haven't seen that since Willie Brown, really. Willie Brown, when he was speaker, he sort of jokingly called himself the Ayatollah of the legislature, sort of referencing his ability to sort of dictate what happened, and Rivas kind of trying to move back in that direction. We'll see how that plays out. There's a lot of grumpiness, I think, right now in both houses with lawmakers, and I think it's indicative of the stuff we talked about around just trying to make everybody happy is hard. But that's a potential liability for leadership, right? You've got an election coming up. You're going to have members in both houses leaving, new folks coming in, and this is often where the speaker, if they don't pick and back the right horse and they have them coming in, I know you've been talking about some of this on your prior episodes, if the speaker doesn't have a good sort of winning streak here and backing the right horses in these legislative districts, and that can be a problem, right? They won't support him for speaker, because that'll be potentially up for consideration when we all come back in December after the election. So yeah, that all kind of lives together in the politics of being the leader, and so we'll see what happens. Mike McGuire on the Senate side, he's trimmed out in 2026. The race to succeed him started the day after he was sworn in, the day after it was announced, frankly, that he would do that. So I don't know. I'm not really anticipating any issues over there. Although, however, it's worth mentioning that he had a defection within his party more recently. I don't know that it was a surprise, but Senator Alvarado Gil was from a district that I think was sort of a fluke by every, campaign analysis that I've seen, that she was able to win that seat as a Democrat, a moderate Democrat. I think everyone sort of saw that was going to flip back to a Republican seat. She switched parties. She left the Democratic Party.
It's just another example of just the dramatic effects of this top two vote getter system that we now have, where you have these strong, clear blue or red districts, right? That are going to elect a Democrat or a Republican. But in her case, in the primary, there was such a crowded field on the Republican side that they all knocked each other out. Mm-hmm. So we're here now, about just over a week left in this 2-year legislative session. I'm just thinking where we were back.
Is it over yet?
I know, right? This past 2 years are just even a blur. We've been talking about some of these pieces of legislation for 2 years, right? And so just in terms of where we're at, and it's a race to the finish. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're starting football season here soon. So just the football analogy, so many of these bills have been brought to the 10-yard line, so to speak, right? And are trying to get into that end zone. Just from your lens, just notable things that shook out.
Yeah, so we've got, as you mentioned, 2-year legislative sessions, right? So we're on the final 2 weeks here of the second year. So everything that doesn't make it this year is dead for the year, and we'll see new bills in January. In my estimation, it's like 2 major buckets of issues going on right now at the end. I would categorize them as labor bills, right? As for ACSA members, labor bills. These are the bills that, it's probably no stranger. You've talked about them on here, and then cell phones in schools conversation, right?
Topic's getting a lot of attention.
A lot of attention. The governor made a special announcement a couple weeks ago about wanting to do more from a state perspective around giving more cover. I think what's going on politically is that teachers are saying, this is exhausting. We're tired of policing cell phones, smartphones in particular, in our classroom. The kids are distracted. Social media use is becoming a problem. It's a vehicle for bullying, right? A lot of teachers saying this is really distracting, and I don't want to have to deal with the parents like it's my classroom policy, right? We need a blanket policy. I think that's kind of what's driving a lot of the conversation. And what's funny is I've talked to a lot of clients and members of ACSA, and the opinion is kind of across the board. I've noticed about whether folks support a more blanket ban or not. But the bill that's kind of out there is actually being carried by a Republican, interestingly, that if the governor were to sign it, would say that schools have got to adopt a policy on cell phone use and update that policy on a regular basis. So leaving in place some local control, but saying you got to have a policy, you got to articulate what it is. So I think that's interesting. So that bill, there's also another bill by Senator Stern that would say that teachers should regulate social media use on the phone, which my feedback to that author has been, you're going to have a lot of teachers saying, how am I going to police what a kid does on their phone, take their phone away from them and go through their phone. I'm not sure that that's a realistic thing. We'll have to see where that goes. The only reason we're talking about it is because the governor said he's for doing something here.
He said a lot of bills are going to make it to the governor's desk, and I think that's why we put so much importance on the suspense hearings, right? Because the cost, the fiscal implications gives legislators some cover to be able to hold bills. And now the expectation is that by and large, bills are going to move that have made it this far in the process to the governor's desk. What is the process like at that point, once it's at the governor's desk, to try and influence a veto?
It's a great question. A lot of what we've been doing trying to influence that has been already happening, right? And so, we talk often about, all right, we need to get a couple people to vote no, right? If we can just get a couple no votes.
We were just talking about the importance of the Ashby,
yeah,
Senator Ashby no vote on 2088.
Absolutely. That is a signal that there's some weakness in the cohesion in the party, right, around the issue. So that kind of stuff's helpful. And so a lot of that's been going on. But also, letters communicating with the governor's staff and the governor directly when they sit and talk about the bill. I mean, Kathy, our mutual friend McBride, at our firm, used to sit with Governor Brown for 6 years on this, and she talks about, we draft up sort of both versions, right? Here's what a veto might look like, and here's what you could sign and what you could say, and all that. So there's a lot of that going on. So infusing now is a good time for folks to be getting involved and making sure that letters are written, arguments are presented to the right folks, but then there's also this political piece that goes on. There are the people in the governor's world that do the policy work and the analysis and everything, but then there's also the political pieces that sort of get infused into that conversation with the chief of staff and other people that are sitting around. So it's a little bit of a stew, right? A soup. There's a lot of ingredients in there to get to it, ultimately get there.
I'm going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball and make a prediction here. Let me ask you specifically about the cell phone topic, because it's one that, again, is just getting so much attention. There's so much conversation. How do you think it plays out this legislative session? I imagine some of this conversation continues beyond this legislative session, but given that the governor has, kind of planted his flag as wanting something in this area and the bills that exist, what do you think happens in this space? The
Josh Hoover bill that would require them for LEAs to annually update some cell phone policy with some guidelines feels like something he would sign to me. So I'm at least 50-50 that gets signed. Is that the end of the conversation? I don't know. It's not maybe what I'm guessing some of the folks in labor want, which is a more clear-cut statewide policy about smartphone use in schools. By the way, it's smartphones, not, part of me wants to get, we've got kids kind of the same age. I got an 8-year-old who I'm dreading the smartphone conversation about, right? But it's like, I'm going to get this kid a flip phone, right? And you got to press 5, 3 times to get the letter you want. Make it difficult, and that kind of a thing. But it really is about smartphones. So there's issues brought up around safety on this issue. Parents want to be able to communicate with their kids around changes in schedule, and there's a lot of good things that can happen with that technology. But we also know there's a dark side to it, and so I think we're just going through this process of trying to sort out how we're going to regulate it and who it applies to. When I talk to people in the field about the cell phone issue, the folks that have young kids and don't have older kids, like I'm middle school, high school, they're all for it, it seems. They're like me, where from my perspective, I'm dreading my son having a smartphone in a classroom in a lot of ways, because social media scares me. And then you've got clients and members of ACSA that I talk to that have older kids that are in middle school and high school, and they live in the world where they can talk to their kids all the time. It's sort of a known thing for them. And they're like, I don't know if I'm for this. And, I just think it's an interesting inflection point, this bill around this issue. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. But given the governor's statements and the politics and just sort of analyzing that piece, I would bet he signs the Hoover bill if right now.
Well, I appreciate you coming on here, and hopefully we're reporting out some really positive news here. But get your seatbelts on, so to speak, and buckle in, because it's gonna be a sprint here to the finish. These last 10 days. And so.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Anytime you want me on your podcast, Iván, I am here.
For sure. This won't be your last time. I look forward to the next time.
I love it.
Thanks for coming on.
For sure.
All right. That's it for episode 4, Behind the Bills. Thanks as always for listening. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Tell your friends about us. Of course, this show is part of the ACSA podcast network, which also includes the Legislative Lunch Break and the Leadership Classroom. Please be sure to check them all out. On behalf of everyone behind the scenes, I'm Iván Carrillo, and we'll see you next time.